It was a normal day for Sarah, the wife of a retired veteran captain. After years of her husband serving in the military, they had settled into a peaceful life. They lived in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. Sarah loved to go out for errands, enjoying the simplicity of everyday life. Little did she know, that day would change everything. Sarah had planned to stop by the local grocery store to pick up some essentials. The store was busy, but nothing unusual seemed to be happening. She grabbed a shopping cart and walked through the aisles, checking off items on her list. She had no idea that her world was about to be turned upside down. As Sarah was walking past the dairy section, 2 police officers approached her. They looked serious, but Sarah didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they needed help with something, she thought. But things quickly took a strange turn. "Excuse me, ma'am, we need to talk to you," one of the officers said, blocking her path. Sarah was a little confused but remained polite, smiling at the officers. "Of course, is there something wrong?" she asked, trying to keep things friendly. But the officer didn't respond in the same calm manner. "You need to come with us," he said. "You're under arrest." Sarah was shocked. "What for?" she asked, not sure if she had heard him right. "I haven't done anything wrong." The second officer, standing beside the first, didn't offer any explanation. He just stared at her coldly, almost like he already made up his mind. Sarah's heart began to race. This wasn't making sense. "Ma'am, you're coming with us," the officer repeated, his tone now colder and more forceful. For a moment, Sarah froze. She was a calm person, someone who always tried to avoid conflict. But this was something else. She wasn't going to make a scene, but she wanted to understand what was going on. "Can you please explain why I'm being arrested?" she asked again, trying to keep her voice steady. Instead of answering, the officer grabbed her arm roughly. Sarah flinched, feeling a wave of panic. Her heart was pounding in her chest. How could this be happening? She hadn't done anything wrong. She tried to pull her arm away, but the officer's grip tightened. She was taken out of the store, her shopping cart left behind, and shoved into the back of the police car. All the while, Sarah stayed calm, but the confusion was eating at her. What had gone wrong? Why were the officers treating her like this? It wasn't long before Sarah's husband, Captain James, found out what had happened. He had been home, going through some paperwork when his phone rang. It was Sarah's friend from the store, frantic and worried. "James, Sarah's been arrested," the voice on the other end said, almost in disbelief. "You need to get down here now." The news hit James hard. He had spent years serving in the military, working to protect and serve his country. The thought of his wife being arrested out of the blue, for no reason he could understand, was enough to make him snap into action. He quickly grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, his heart pounding. What had happened? When he arrived at the police station, the officers tried to stop him, but James wasn't having it. He was a man who had fought for his country and protected others. This wasn't right. His wife didn't deserve this. His mind was racing, but he focused on one thing: getting her out. "Where is she?" James demanded as soon as he stepped into the building. "I need to see my wife." The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. James could feel something wasn't right. His instincts as a former soldier kicked in. He wasn't about to back down. The story was far from over. Captain James stood at the entrance of the police station, his mind racing. He had always been trained to stay calm in stressful situations, but seeing his wife wrongfully arrested had shaken him to his core. He needed to get to Sarah, and he needed to understand what was going on. The officers at the front desk looked uneasy as James stepped forward. "Where is my wife? I demand to see her," he said firmly, his voice calm but filled with urgency. The officer behind the counter hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sir, please wait here," the officer said, trying to avoid eye contact. James could see the nervousness in his face, but he didn't have time for delays. "No, I'm not waiting," James snapped. "This is my wife we're talking about. She's done nothing wrong." and I want answers now." After a long pause, the officer finally motioned for James to follow him. They walked down a narrow hallway to a small interrogation room. The door creaked open, and there sat Sarah, her face pale but determined. She was handcuffed to a chair, but her posture remained strong, as if she refused to let the situation break her. The moment she saw James, relief washed over her face. She had been trying to keep her composure, but the stress of the wrongful arrest had taken a toll on her. She had never expected anything like this to happen, especially in such a quiet, familiar place. "James," she exclaimed softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know what happened. One moment, I was just shopping, and the next thing I know, I'm being dragged out of the store." James took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. He couldn't believe this was happening. His wife, a kind and peaceful woman, had been arrested for no reason at all. He knew he needed to stay calm and focused for her. "Don't worry, Sarah. I'm going to get you out of here," he said, trying to reassure her. His military training kicked in. He had faced far worse situations before, and he wasn't going to let this one defeat him. The officer who had escorted James into the room stood quietly by the door, watching them. "She needs to stay here for questioning," the officer said, trying to sound official. But there was something in his tone that made James feel uneasy. It wasn't just the matter-of-factness of his words. It was something deeper, something James couldn't quite put his finger on. "Questioning," James repeated, his voice rising. "There's nothing to question. My wife is innocent. You have no right to keep her here." The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He simply turned and walked away, leaving James and Sarah alone. The door closed with a quiet click, and James immediately knelt beside Sarah. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking at her closely. He could see the strain in her eyes, but she was trying her best to hold it together. "I'm scared, James," she admitted quietly. "They wouldn't tell me why they arrested me. They just said I was under suspicion." James frowned. He had a sinking feeling in his stomach. This wasn't just a case of a misunderstanding. Something wasn't right here. He had been around long enough to know when things didn't add up, and this situation was full of red flags. "I'm going to fix this, Sarah," he said firmly. "You'll be out of here in no time. Just trust me." He kissed her gently on the forehead, trying to offer the comfort she so desperately needed. But deep down, James knew this wasn't going to be easy. The truth was, something much bigger was going on, and they were about to uncover it. Captain James sat in the small interrogation room with his wife, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what was happening. His peaceful life, built on years of military service, was now being turned upside down. Sarah, the woman he loved, was being wrongfully detained, and he wasn't about to let this slide. The officers had left them alone for a moment, but James knew they wouldn't be gone for long. His thoughts quickly turned to action. He needed to get Sarah out of here, and he needed to do it fast. "Sarah, listen to me," James said, looking her in the eyes. "I'm not going to let them get away with this. You've done nothing wrong, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." Sarah gave him a small, thankful smile. She was still shaken, but she trusted him. "James, I'm scared," she whispered. "They're not telling me anything. I don't know what's going to happen." "I know, sweetheart," James replied gently, taking her hand in his. "But I've fought for this country before. I've faced much harder battles. This is nothing." Sarah's eyes softened, a flicker of hope lighting up her face. She knew James had seen terrible things in his years of service, but the strength he had always shown was something she admired. He was a fighter. As the door creaked open, the same officer from before entered the room. He didn't meet James's eyes, and James could tell the officer was trying to avoid any confrontation. But James wasn't going to let that happen. He stood up and walked toward the officer with steady steps, his military training kicking in. "I need to speak to your superior," James said firmly. "Now." The officer hesitated but then nodded. "I'll let them know," he muttered, stepping back out of the room. James turned back to Sarah. "Don't worry, everything will be fine," he reassured her. His tone was confident, but inside, he was growing more frustrated. How could this be happening to them? They had always followed the rules, never caused any trouble. But now, his wife was caught in a situation she didn't deserve, and it was time for him to take charge. Minutes passed, and the officer returned with a higher-ranking officer in tow. This new officer, a sergeant, seemed less nervous but still unwilling to engage in any meaningful conversation. "What's going on here?" James demanded, his voice sharp. "My wife was arrested for no reason. I want to know why." The sergeant stood still, avoiding eye contact. "She's under investigation. That's all I can say for now," he replied flatly. James could feel the anger rising inside him. Under investigation. For what? She was just shopping in a store. You can't just arrest someone without telling them why. The sergeant shifted uncomfortably. "You'll have to take that up with the department. Right now, she needs to stay here." James clenched his fists, trying to keep his temper in check. He had dealt with difficult situations in his life, but this was personal. His wife had been treated unfairly, and he wasn't about to let it slide. "I'm not leaving here without my wife," James said, his voice low but firm. "And if I have to call a lawyer, I will. I won't let you or anyone else keep her locked up without cause." The sergeant looked at him for a moment, and James could see the hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't used to dealing with someone who wasn't intimidated. James was calm but insistent, and the sergeant knew he wasn't backing down. After a long pause, the sergeant finally spoke. "Fine. We'll have to get the details sorted out. But for now, she stays here." James nodded, not satisfied with the answer, but knowing this battle was far from over. He knew he had to be strategic. This wasn't just about getting his wife released. This was about finding out why she had been wrongfully arrested and making sure it never happened again. As he turned to Sarah, he squeezed her hand. "I'll fix this," he said. "You'll see. Just hold on a little longer." Sarah smiled weakly, trusting that James would do whatever it took to get them through this storm. She had no doubt that he would. But James knew this was just the beginning, and the fight for justice was only starting. The hours seemed to stretch on forever as Captain James sat in the waiting area, frustration gnawing at him. He hadn't left the police station since his wife's arrest. Despite his calm exterior, inside he was boiling with anger. He couldn't believe how his life had turned upside down in just a few short hours. His wife, Sarah, was still being held without any clear reason, and James was growing more determined by the minute to get her out. He had made some phone calls earlier. His lawyer, Greg, was already on his way. James trusted Greg's judgment and knew that once the lawyer arrived, things would start moving. But still, the feeling of helplessness weighed on him. As he sat, his mind kept returning to the same question. Why was Sarah arrested? She had done nothing wrong. She had simply been shopping, enjoying an ordinary day. And then she was dragged away. Something didn't add up, and James knew that he needed to uncover the truth. Around midnight, Greg finally arrived at the police station. The lawyer was a tall man in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense attitude. He shook hands with James firmly. "I got your message," Greg said, his voice steady. "Let's see what we're dealing with here." The two of them went straight to the officer in charge, demanding to see the details of Sarah's arrest. The officer looked at them with suspicion but didn't dare deny their request. James and Greg were both persistent, and it wasn't long before they were granted access to the police records. As they combed through the information, Greg started to notice a few strange things. The report was vague and lacking important details. There was no clear explanation for why Sarah had been arrested. All it said was that she was under suspicion for something, but it didn't specify what. The more they looked, the more it became clear that something wasn't right. "Look at this," Greg said, pointing to a section of the report. "This officer claims Sarah was acting suspiciously, but there's nothing in the record that supports that." No witnesses, no evidence. This is a mess. James stared at the document, his suspicions growing. He knew his wife. She wasn't the type to get into trouble. She was kind, polite, and always respectful. The thought that she could be arrested for no reason seemed impossible, but the evidence in front of him was undeniable. Something was definitely off. "I'll get in touch with the department's internal affairs," Greg continued. "This doesn't look like a simple mistake. This could be something much worse." As the night dragged on, James felt a mix of anger and determination building inside him. He knew they weren't just dealing with an isolated mistake. This felt like something more sinister, like Sarah was being targeted for reasons beyond her control. It was clear that racial bias was playing a role, but James didn't have proof yet. That was something he was going to change. In the meantime, Greg was working tirelessly to contact other potential witnesses. They needed someone who had seen the arrest and could confirm Sarah's side of the story. If they could find that witness, they could build a stronger case against the officers who had wrongfully detained her. As the night wore on, James's resolve only grew stronger. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let his wife suffer for something she didn't do. He was going to fight for her, no matter what it took. And this fight, he knew, was just beginning. At around 2 a.m., they received a call from one of Sarah's friends, a woman who had witnessed the arrest. "I saw everything," the friend said, her voice shaking. "I didn't know what to do at the time, but now, I know you need to hear what really happened." James's heart raced with anticipation. Finally, the pieces were starting to fall into place. They had their first real lead. The truth was coming to light, and soon, the officers responsible for this injustice would have to answer for their actions. The next morning, James felt a renewed sense of hope. After hours of waiting, the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to come together. Sarah's friend had provided the first real break in the case. The woman, Lisa, had witnessed the entire arrest and was willing to testify. James knew that this could be the key to exposing the truth. Lisa had described the scene clearly. She told James how Sarah had been standing in the dairy aisle when the officers first approached her. There was no sign of any suspicious behavior, just Sarah calmly shopping like any other customer. Lisa had been just a few feet away and could hear the officers making demands that didn't make sense. "I saw the whole thing," Lisa had explained over the phone. "She was just minding her own business, picking out some milk. I thought maybe they were looking for someone else, but then they just started pulling her away. It didn't feel right. Something was off, and I didn't know what to do." James listened carefully, noting every detail. Lisa's account was invaluable. It confirmed what he had suspected all along, that Sarah hadn't done anything wrong. The officers had made a snap judgment, and now Sarah was paying the price for it. With this new information, James and Greg, his lawyer, decided to take the next step. They were going to demand a full investigation into the arrest. But they knew this wouldn't be easy. They would face resistance, especially from the police department, who might be reluctant to acknowledge any wrongdoing. James wasn't about to back down. He had seen too much injustice in his life not to recognize it when it happened. He was determined to see this through, no matter the challenges. The first move was to get in touch with Internal Affairs, the department responsible for investigating police misconduct. James had a feeling that things were going to get complicated quickly. He wasn't just asking for a simple review of the case. He was accusing the officers involved of misconduct. He wasn't sure how far this would go, but he knew they had to start somewhere. Internal Affairs was slow to respond at first. James and Greg were left waiting, their patience wearing thin. But just as the days seemed to drag on, they received an unexpected call. The department had agreed to look into the matter further. They would review the body camera footage of the incident, which James hoped would be the smoking gun they needed. Finally, Greg said when he received the call, "This could change everything." James could hardly believe it. The body camera footage had the potential to prove once and for all that Sarah's arrest was unjust. It could show the officers' actions in real time, providing the evidence they needed to hold them accountable. James was cautiously optimistic. They had been fighting for so long, and now they were finally getting the break they had hoped for. As they prepared to meet with Internal Affairs, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. The officers involved in the arrest were just the tip of the iceberg. There had to be more. Perhaps a pattern of behavior that had been overlooked or ignored. The meeting with Internal Affairs was scheduled for the following week. James and Greg were ready to make their case, armed with Lisa's testimony and the promise of the body camera footage. James couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. They were on the verge of uncovering something big, something that would change everything. The journey wasn't over yet, but they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. And James knew that, no matter what happened, he would continue to fight for justice, no matter the cost. The days following their meeting with Internal Affairs were filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. While James and Greg felt confident that they were finally on the right path, they knew that uncovering the truth wouldn't be easy. The police department had already made it clear that they weren't eager to admit fault. But with Lisa's testimony and the body camera footage, James believed they were in a strong position. Then, something unexpected happened. News of Sarah's arrest began to spread. A local news outlet caught wind of the situation and started covering the story. Soon, the media's interest grew, and the story went viral on social media. People were shocked and outraged by the wrongful arrest, especially after learning the details. Many felt it was another example of the kind of injustice that had been happening far too often. For the first time, the story was no longer just about James and Sarah. It became a symbol of the fight against racial profiling and police misconduct. The story resonated with so many who had faced similar struggles, and they began to rally around the couple. James and Sarah had always kept a low profile, enjoying their quiet life. But now, they found themselves at the center of a public outcry. Support poured in from all corners: friends, family, and even strangers who wanted to show their support. It was a humbling experience, but also one that gave them strength. They weren't alone anymore. Their fight for justice was now everyone's fight. The public backlash against the police officers involved grew stronger by the day. Protests were held outside the police station, with signs calling for accountability and justice. The local community, once so quiet and peaceful, was now buzzing with conversations about the wrongful arrest. People from all walks of life came together to demand change. James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the support they were receiving. It was clear that Sarah's case wasn't an isolated one. This was part of a larger issue, one that affected many people who had been mistreated or wrongfully accused. The more people spoke out, the clearer it became that they weren't just fighting for Sarah anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. Even though the support was overwhelming, it also made James more determined. He wasn't just fighting to get his wife released. He was fighting to make sure that this kind of thing didn't happen again. He wanted to be part of the change. He wanted to be the one who stood up and said, "This isn't right. We won't tolerate it anymore." As the pressure on the police department mounted, Internal Affairs had no choice but to speed up their investigation. The body camera footage, which they had hoped would be their final piece of evidence, had been reviewed by the department, and it was damning. It showed Sarah being arrested without cause, treated unfairly, and subjected to unnecessary hostility by the officers involved. James knew this was the turning point. With the public's support, the footage, and Lisa's testimony, they were finally in a position to demand justice. The officers who had wrongfully arrested Sarah were facing serious consequences. Despite the mounting pressure, the couple remained calm and focused. They knew the fight wasn't over yet. There was still much to be done before they could say they had truly won. But for the first time in days, James felt a sense of relief. The truth was out, and the support from the public gave them the strength they needed to keep going. In that moment, James realized something important. This wasn't just a personal battle for his wife's freedom. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly. and he was proud to be standing up for what was right. The weeks that followed the public outcry were tense. James and Sarah were focused on their goal, seeking justice for the wrongful arrest. They had gathered evidence, received support from the community, and were preparing for the final stages of their battle. But just when they thought they were close to having the case resolved, a new and unexpected revelation shocked everyone involved. It came in the form of a phone call one afternoon. Greg, their lawyer, had been working tirelessly behind the scenes to uncover more details about the officers involved in Sarah's arrest. And that afternoon, his efforts paid off. "James, we've uncovered something big," Greg said when he called. "You're not going to believe this." James's heart skipped a beat. After all the pressure, all the waiting, he wasn't sure if he was ready for any more surprises. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Greg paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "The officer who arrested Sarah, Officer Matthews, he's been involved in several similar incidents in the past. This isn't the first time he's wrongfully detained someone, especially people of color." James's stomach sank. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It wasn't just an isolated incident. Officer Matthews had a history of questionable behavior, and now they had proof. The investigation into Matthews revealed a pattern of racial profiling and unjust arrests, all carried out in a similar manner. Each case was dismissed, but Matthews had never faced serious consequences. Internal Affairs had overlooked his past actions, and it seemed that his behavior had been allowed to continue unchecked. "That explains a lot," James said, his voice filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "No wonder they tried to cover this up. They've been turning a blind eye for years." Greg agreed. "It gets worse. I've also found out that Officer Matthews isn't the only one with a questionable record. There are others involved in this department who have a history of mistreating people. This could go much deeper than we thought." James clenched his fists, his anger rising once again. He had always known that this wasn't just about Sarah, but now it was clear that the issue was much bigger than a single case. It was about a culture within the police department that allowed this kind of behavior to continue, unchecked and unnoticed. Greg assured James that they would move quickly to gather more evidence and take action. With Matthews' history now exposed, they had a powerful new angle in the case. This revelation was going to change everything. The public response to this new information was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, and the public was outraged that such behavior had been allowed to persist. Protests grew even larger, with people demanding a full investigation into the entire police department. It was clear now that Sarah's case was not just about a wrongful arrest. It was part of a much larger issue of systemic injustice that had been ignored for too long. For James and Sarah, this new revelation was both devastating and empowering. They were no longer just fighting for Sarah's freedom. They were now fighting for all the victims who had been wronged by this corrupt system. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back. As they prepared for the next steps, James felt a deep sense of responsibility. He knew that, with the truth on their side, they had the chance to make real change. But he also knew the road ahead would be difficult. It was clear that the fight was far from over, but for the first time, he truly believed they were going to win. The officers involved in the wrongful arrest were no longer just facing public pressure. They were now facing serious consequences. The truth had come to light, and with it, the hope for justice had never been stronger. The pressure was on. After the shocking revelations about Officer Matthews and his history of unjust arrests, the tide began to shift. The public outcry grew louder, and the media continued to shine a spotlight on the corrupt practices within the police department. It was clear now that the story wasn't just about one wrongful arrest. It was about a much larger issue of police misconduct and racial profiling that had been ignored for far too long. James and Sarah felt a sense of hope, but they knew the road ahead would be challenging. The investigation into the officers involved in Sarah's arrest was moving forward, but the system didn't always work quickly. It was hard to trust that the department would handle things fairly. Still, they couldn't ignore the momentum that had built around their case. They had the truth on their side, and they weren't going to stop until justice was served. Internal affairs, under growing pressure from the public and from higher authorities, began to take action. They launched a full investigation into Officer Matthews, as well as the other officers who had been involved in Sarah's arrest. The department couldn't ignore the mounting evidence, and it was clear that the officers' actions were inexcusable. James knew it wasn't just about holding these officers accountable. It was about sending a message to the entire system that this kind of behavior would no longer be tolerated. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it came the hope for real change. The moment of reckoning came when Officer Matthews was placed on administrative leave. The other officers involved in the wrongful arrest were also under investigation. James felt a small sense of relief, but he knew that this was just the beginning. He had seen too many cases where officers faced only temporary consequences, only to return to their positions later. But this time, things felt different. The public was watching closely, and the support from the community was unwavering. People were demanding real change, not just empty promises. The investigation was now in the hands of those who could make a difference, and James was hopeful that justice would be served. A few days later, James received a call from Greg. The news was both a relief and a step forward in their fight. Officer Matthews had been fired from the force, and the other officers involved had been placed under review. The investigation was far from over, but this was a victory that James and Sarah had been waiting for. The officers are facing serious consequences, Greg told James, his voice filled with a sense of satisfaction. This is the start of something bigger. The department has no choice but to address the systemic issues that allowed this to happen. James felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He wasn't one to celebrate too soon, but this felt like a turning point. For so long, he had felt powerless in the face of injustice. But now, he saw the power of standing up and fighting for what was right. The system was finally being forced to take a hard look at itself. Sarah, who had been through so much in the past few weeks, smiled weakly as James shared the news with her. She had been through a whirlwind of emotions, but now there was a sense of hope. Justice was starting to be served, and that was all they had wanted from the beginning. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the changes they had hoped for were beginning to take shape. The police department was under scrutiny, and the officers involved in the wrongful arrest were being held accountable. The journey had been long and difficult, but James and Sarah knew they had made a difference. The public's demand for change was not going away. The fight was not over, but with every step, James and Sarah felt more confident that they were on the right path. They had taken a stand, and their voices had been heard. The fight for justice was far from finished, but it had already changed their lives, and the lives of many others, forever. Weeks passed, and the investigation continued to unfold. The pressure on the police department grew stronger with every new piece of evidence that came to light. James and Sarah had fought hard for the truth, and now they could see the first signs of real change. But even though they were closer to victory, the road ahead still held a few challenges. James had always known that nothing was going to be easy, but seeing the consequences unfold before him, he began to believe that this was more than just a fight for Sarah. It was a fight for everyone who had suffered at the hands of injustice. The phone call that James received late one afternoon confirmed what he had been hoping for. It was Greg, their lawyer, and he sounded both relieved and excited. "James, it's done. The case is officially closed. They've dismissed all charges against Sarah, and the officers involved are facing serious disciplinary action." James felt a mix of emotions: relief, pride, and even a little disbelief. After everything they had been through, the endless hours of waiting, the pressure, and the uncertainty, it was finally over. Sarah's name had been cleared, and justice had been served. But there was more to the victory. Officer Matthews had been fired, and the other officers involved in the wrongful arrest had been placed under review. The public response to the case had been overwhelming, and it had forced the police department to confront the systemic issues within their ranks. The change that James and Sarah had hoped for was starting to take shape. Sarah, who had been through so much in the past few weeks, let out a quiet sigh of relief when James shared the news with her. She had been through the emotional roller coaster of the arrest, the long nights of uncertainty, and the public attention that had come with the case. But now, she felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She was finally free of the burden that had haunted her since that fateful day in the store. "I can't believe it," Sarah said, her voice filled with emotion. "After everything, it's finally over." James smiled and took her hand. "It's not just over for us. It's over for everyone who has been wronged by a system that didn't listen. You've shown people what it means to stand up for what's right." Their story had become more than just an example of one family's fight for justice. It had become a symbol of hope for many who had felt powerless against the injustices of the world. People across the country were inspired by James and Sarah's strength, and the movement for change was gaining momentum. As the days passed, the police department began to implement reforms. New policies were put in place to prevent racial profiling, and officers were required to undergo additional training. The public's demand for change had not been in vain. James and Sarah had played a key role in pushing for that change, and their fight had made a real difference. As they sat together in their home, reflecting on everything they had been through, James and Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was ongoing, and there was still much work to be done. But they were no longer fighting alone. The support they had received from the community, from strangers who believed in their cause, had given them the strength to keep going. "We did it," Sarah said, looking at James with a smile. "We really did it." James squeezed her hand, his heart full of pride. "We did, and we'll keep fighting together." The victory wasn't just about clearing Sarah's name. It was about changing a broken system and making sure that no one else would have to face the same injustice. Their story was one of hope, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. And as they moved forward, they knew that they had made a lasting impact on the world around them.